Welcome back to the Community of Innovation podcast brought to you by the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, otherwise known as CABHI. I'm Allison Sekuler, President and Chief Scientist at CABHI and the Baycrest Academy for Research and Education.
And I'm Rosanne Aleong, Executive Director of Research, Innovation, and Translation at the Baycrest Academy and the Director of Research, Innovation, and Translation at CABHI. Today, we dive deeply into the financial health of older adults, the opportunities, the challenges, and how important it is to plan and be prepared. In fact, in a recent Angus Reid poll, only half of Canadians between the ages of 55 to 64 reported having an up-to-date will, and that actually may very well be an overestimate. Although many of us don't like to think about it, making a will is an important part of the process. And today's guest will share some key tips to consider as you begin thinking about your financial and estate planning. Okay, Allison, I never thought I would say this, but we had kind of hilarious conversation about making wills. And it was actually a blast, which seems counterintuitive. But what stood out for you?
There were so many myths and misconceptions that I had going into this conversation. And so I know I actually learned so much, and I'm thinking about, wills and, power of attorneys and all of those sorts of things in a completely different way. And I wouldn't say like I'm really like excited and I think it's going to be super fun, but it's sounds like it's going to be more fun than I thought it would be, and I'm sort of looking to forward to it a bit more. And I have to say the other thing that really struck me was, one of the myths that people often have is that, you don't really need to even start thinking about a will until, first of all, only if you're really rich or only if you're, really old. But folks may not know, but Rosanne and I are involved in another podcast called Defy Dementia, where we talk about how to decrease your dementia risk and, show some great examples of stories of people who are living with dementia and caregivers and so on. But one of the mottos we have there is you're never too young or too old, right? In that case, it's to start thinking about how to decrease your dementia risk. I think we could have that here too. You're never too young or too old to start thinking about making that will. So that was, I think, a really interesting, idea that came. And I'm going to talk to my kids who are in their 20s, not just about, us making sure we have our wills in place as the parents, but let's get the kids' wills in place too. How about you? What stood out for you?
2 words: death drawer.
Death drawer.
One of our guests brought up this amazing approach for those people who find even bringing up this conversation hard, who are finding it hard to think about, don't even know where to start. One of our guests just mentioned death drawer. And I'm not going to go further into it because you got to listen to the full episode to learn. But it was kind of like revolutionary to think about it.
It's become a thing now.
Yes. Yes. So I'm going to tease death drawer. That's what stood out for me from this episode. Our audience absolutely has to listen because I think it's actually a way for people, a point of entry to this hard topic for people, because in all seriousness, it is a hard topic to enter into. And if you can come into it with humor, with, slowly, gently, in phases, the death drawer can guide you there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to let people understand what is a death drawer. So let's get to the show. Our first guest is Erin Burry, who is an entrepreneur, speaker, startup advisor, and former technology journalist. She's a Jill of all trades, including being the co-founder and CEO at Willful, which is an online estate planning platform that makes it easy for Canadians to create a will. Willful is also a CABHI portfolio company, meaning that Erin and her team have successfully applied to one of our funding programs. So congratulations to you for that, Erin, and welcome to the CABHI family. At Willful, Erin is responsible for driving the company's mission to make it easier for Canadians to prepare for and deal with death in a digital age. And she's also a board member at Save the Children Canada. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you, Allison and Rosanne. Nice to be here.
Our second guest is Laura Tamblyn-Watts. As CEO of CanAge, she embodies a commitment to the betterment of elder care and the rights of older adults. Her multifaceted career spans law, academia, and policy development, reflecting a dedication to impactful advocacy and education. With a legal background as a member of the BC Bar since 1999, Laura has served as National Director of the Canadian Centre for Elder Law and as Chief Public Policy Officer at CARP. She is also an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Factor in Wentosh Faculty of Social Work. Laura, welcome to the pod.
So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, we're going to kick off, I think, by doing a little bit of level setting for our audience. And Laura, maybe I'll turn over to you. What do we mean when we talk about financial wellness for older adults?
Sometimes we think about it as a practical term. Can you pay your bills? Can you make ends meet? Are you at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy? Do you have enough money for food, prescriptions? Are you able to make sure that you're healthy and well to the best possible scenario and that you don't have precarity? That's often what I think about. Are you going to be able to absorb a bit of a shock if you need a bit of extra care? Are you able to do that extra thing that needs to be paid for? That's a bit of a surprise. On a longer term, we think of it as financial resilience. Are you able to either have enough money or make enough money to keep yourself on the level? And that also means that you've got a plan for if you can't make decisions, someone else can help you or do it for you.
Erin, from Willful's perspective, what does financial wellness mean?
I think financial wellness means having a plan, not just for how your finances are handled now, but also what happens when you pass away, and having the key discussions, both about your current finances and any future plans with your loved ones. And that can be a really intimidating thing. You know, as you mentioned, we don't love to consider our own mortality. We'd much rather watch Netflix and, think about fun things, but we're going to leave behind loved ones who have to deal with our estate. And if we ever are incapacitated and need someone to make decisions for us, empowering them with the knowledge about what accounts we hold, where to find important documents is so crucial. So, financial wellness also means empowering people with the knowledge that they need to make sure that they can do right by you.
And one of the things that people might be wondering is I mentioned that Erin's company, Willful, is a CABHI company, and we are the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation. So folks may be wondering, what has all that got to do with aging and brain health? And so I'm wondering, what's top of mind for both of you? What are the issues that older adults are facing when it comes to their financial wellness? Maybe you can give our listeners some insight as to what is the relationship between financial wellness and brain health, for example. And Laura, maybe we can start with you and you can tell us about what it is that you're seeing.
We used to think about financial wellness, particularly in a time where we lived in three stages. You were young and you were doing education, you were in your middle years and you were making money, hopefully, or raising kids, or doing both of those things together. And then somehow you're moving into retirement. And just to give you a sense, when we designed the CPP, 65 was the age that benefits kick in, and 67 was the age that we would mostly drop dead quickly. We are having a very different experience with longevity. And so one of those things that happens is significant impacts to brain health. Why we care about that, particularly in the financial wellness point of view, is, with the average amount of time a person in Canada waits to get a diagnosis of cognitive impairments, but 7 to 10 years. And the very first thing to go, and sometimes in a very subtle way, is that executive function, particularly around abstract finance.
Ability to plan.
That's it. And so we're not buying some milk and I'm going to give you money and get money back. We're doing that. But what does a portfolio mean, or how does an interest rate impact us? And so if we don't have a good understanding about our financial well-being and brain health, we can get ourselves into some really hard situations.
And so what are you hearing when you're talking to older adults out there about what their biggest concerns are in terms of, financial wellness?
These days, it's about making ends meet. It doesn't tend to have really high level concerns. Even people who consider themselves fairly secure, fairly middle class, are being crunched. And part of that is because this generation of boomers are the most indebted generation we've ever had. They owe on average $1.76 for every dollar of assets they have. Part of that is because interest rates were really low, which meant debt was really cheap. So you could borrow, except that ultimately they weren't making money on their investment. So it's a bit of a twist on that. Now what's happening, of course, is not only are interest rates going up, but cost of living is going up sharply. And that means people who thought they were fine in their own homes, even not people that you would necessarily think about as financially precarious, are finding that they are. And that means things like not being able to pay for heat or making decisions about whether or not they're getting their prescriptions filled. And for those people who are at the lower end of that financial security spectrum, it's even harder.
Yeah, and you mentioned financial resilience earlier, when you were talking with Rosanne, and, how resilient do you think older adults are today?
Less than we were 10 years ago, partly because we have longer to stretch for those monies. So when you go into your financial planning session, assuming you've ever had a financial planning session at any point of your life, and they were calculating how long you could expect to live, they were probably calculating into your 70s, maybe even early 70s or late 60s when this generation of older adults was there. And the reality of the circumstance is, for many people, they have successfully lived much longer, but really weren't planning for it. So there's a structural problem with financial resilience. The other problem is we know that there are lots of costs that people don't think about. So just to kind of give you a sense, people say, oh, long-term care, it's free. Well, no, it's not. Or I can get lots of home care. Well, you probably can't. And if you're paying for somebody to come in and provide that miracle idea of 24/7 home care with any kind of training whatsoever, I'm not talking an RN, I'm just meaning somebody with some training. Conservatively, it's 100,000 a year. Much more likely it's a $300,000 commitment a year. And we never talked about that when we were thinking about what it means. And the consumer price index, the things that we match those public policy incomes to, they don't make sense for older people. They're based on young families with kids, and they don't include things like prescriptions and care.
So that idea of having 3 stages to the life actually probably is outdated, and there's multiple stages well beyond the 3. Erin, from your perspective, what are you hearing older adults talking about? What are the concerns in financial wellness?
Well, I can speak for my dad, whose favorite saying is, I'm on a fixed income whenever I ask him to do something. So, but it is that point, and Laura made that extremely succinctly about, you know, more of us don't have. It's certainly something even at age approaching 40 that I'm thinking about. If I live to be 100 and I retire at X age and I don't have a pension, how am I going to make things last? So certainly it's older adults who are facing that today, but it's every generation who's thinking about, how am I going to be able to fund my future? I think the one thing that I see a lot is accessibility. And I mean that from so many different perspectives. Accessibility from a financial perspective. Can I afford financial planners, lawyers, all of these things that do cost money when I have to choose between paying my heat bill and buying eggs? But also accessibility in terms of internet access, particularly in rural areas. Mobility. Can I actually get to a financial institution or a lawyer's office? And so, accessibility is something that I think online services can really bridge the gap on. But then there's also tech literacy, right? We see articles in the news every day around scammers taking advantage of older adults and, frankly, adults of all ages. But a lot of that comes back to, are we empowering our older adults in Canada to be able to navigate, online tools and to be able to take some of these applications that have really democratized finance and access to justice and to be able to use them themselves with no support?
Yeah, and in that context, I wonder if in some way you're also alluding to some of these health equity issues and social diversity issues that some certain parts of our population may be more at risk and also have more challenges in accessing the tools that they need.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm a big library user locally here in Prince Edward County, and they do so many seminars for older adults on training them on tech literacy, on running workshops on scams. But We really need more of that education. And obviously, CanAge does an amazing job of providing resources and advocating for more tools. And we have seen an impetus in the recent government to provide broadband access to rural areas and to really put a focus on this. So I think we're making strides forward, but we're about to go through, we're already in the middle of the largest wealth transfer in history as the boomers age. And so, to Laura's point about long-term care and in-home care, there's also going to be this wave of financial implications as people pass away and assets start getting handed down, and we start realizing what a lack of planning means in practice.
Yeah, I think increasingly we're seeing that tech equity is health equity.
So that leads beautifully, I think, into my next question. We've kind of talked at the high level of some of these issues, but I think our audience wants to get at a little bit of the nitty gritty. And so I mentioned at the top the importance of wills in the financial planning process. And I know that I think when I went through the process, there was a lot that I thought I knew that I actually didn't know. So maybe, Laura, let's start with you. What exactly is a will and what exactly does it cover? Because I think I went into the process thinking, oh, it covered XYZ, ABC, and I learned rapidly that was not correct. So let's get the correct information to our audience. Laura, over to you.
The first thing you need to know about a will is it only is about when you're dead. And that may sound evident to the audience, but it's because when we think about the different kinds of documents, you really also need to make something called powers of attorney. Now, those have slightly different names in different jurisdictions. So if you're in BC, it's going to be an enduring power of attorney for your money, and it's going to be called a representation agreement for your health and well-being in that regard. If you're in Nova Scotia, again, you're going to have an enduring power of attorney. You're going to have a healthcare directive. Here in Ontario, you're looking at enduring power of attorney and, a continuing power of attorney. See, even I got it wrong. A continuing power of attorney, and you're also going to look at a power of attorney for personal care. It's really important to know that both of these things can only be made when you yourself are mentally capable of making them. A slight little bit there on BC, it's a little bit different there, but on the whole, these are documents that you make for yourself where you pick somebody else to make decisions for you. If it's a power of attorney, it's a substitute decision-making docket. So think about you crossing the street, hit by a bus, you're in a coma, someone's got to pay your mortgage, someone's got to try to figure out whether you have surgery, right? Someone's also got to have access to your insurance documents and increasingly your technology, which is one of the things that we really also have to talk about. It's not just what's in your bank account or if you own a house. It's anything that you can do for yourself financially while you're alive. That's going to be some type of continuing or enduring power of attorney. Anything about whether or not you get care, and that can mean also where you live or what you wear and how you brush your teeth. It's that kind of stuff that is in that personal care or healthcare directive point of view. Again, slightly different names in different places. All of those things are really important while you're alive. The minute you die, the power of those things dies with them. So if you are saying, I am the person who's the power of attorney, and you're like, that's great, but Bob's dead, right? It doesn't help. It's all done too. It's like the heartbeat of that document dies with the heartbeat of the person. And then what snaps into effect is a will. Now, it might be the same person, but think of it as a hat rack. You take off the hat of being the power of attorney and you put on a different hat that means you're the executor or a trustee, and then you take over from there. So that's the difference between those two. Really important to have both.
Now that's helpful because that was something I learned quite rapidly because I was under the misconception that the will did take care of me while I was alive.
And that is absolutely what most people kind of think too. So it's very, very, very common. When you go in, if you're talking through these kinds of things, I think of it as kind of, there used to be a band from, I think, the 80s called Dead or Alive. That's what I think about, right? It's dead or alive. Okay. So if it's about dead, it's a will. If it's about alive, it's some kind of substitute decision-making document. We often think of those as called powers of attorney. Again, slightly different jurisdictions. This is the lawyer in me. I'm going to tell you one more thing. Not only is it a little bit different, the rules about making what's in a will, who can do it are mostly the same across the country with a little bit of a difference, okay? And that little bit of a difference does matter. So if you are, for instance, in Ontario and you live in Ontario, but you had a will made in British Columbia, is it valid? Well, Yes, but it's going to be a pain. Same with a power of attorney. What you want to do is, if you have moved, you want to do the documents again in a new jurisdiction, because they're not automatically recognized. It becomes, I'm not saying they can't be, but you may end up going to court to try to get those things proved. No one wants that. So if you've moved, change your documents to that jurisdiction as quickly as possible.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of people will not be thinking about that, and in fact, some people might have multiple residences at any one time. So, I'm wondering, Erin or Laura, what about all of the snowbirds in Canada? There's a lot of people who, for example, live in Canada for most of the time, but then, during the winter months, they may have a place down south somewhere, in the southern United States or Mexico or Thailand or wherever, in somewhere a warmer clime. What happens in those cases?
Well, Allison, I wish I was one of those people who did live in a warm climate right now. I can tell you my dad, who, as we know, is on a fixed income, does have a place in Florida, is there enjoying the sun right now. And you've highlighted a great point, which is there can be complexity, whether you have foreign assets, whether you're part of a blended family and you want to ensure that your assets go to your children and not to your stepchildren. Maybe you're a business owner and you want to separate those assets so that they're not subject to probate fees in your province. There are a variety of different complexities that can exist. And that's really going to dictate the method you choose to make your will. As Laura mentioned, a will is a high level legal document that says, here's who can, execute my wishes, my executor, when I pass away. Here's who gets my assets. Here's who takes care of any children and increasingly pets when I pass away. And the method you choose to make it can depend on your province, but generally you can either handwrite a will, which depends on you having some knowledge about what to put down on paper, but obviously low barrier to entry there. You can go to a lawyer or a notary, depending on your province, which is going to be the most comprehensive and allow you to tackle some of those complex issues. And of course, is going to allow you to get legal advice about your situation, which is really key if you just want that comfort level of making sure that your unique situation has been addressed. And then in the middle, there are platforms like what we've built at Willful, which are kind of like the TurboTax for estate planning. So you're not getting that one-to-one legal advice. And generally, platforms like ours are not able to handle a lot of complexity. For example, creating a secondary will in Florida to cover my dad's property there. We've built in a lot of stopgaps and guidance on, hey, here's what we do handle, here's what we don't, here's when you may want to visit a lawyer instead. And you can also, of course, read content online, talk to a lawyer to get an understanding of what's the best fit for your budget, for your needs, and most importantly, your comfort level. So you feel empowered to understand, to Laura's point, what's in this document and to make sure that it reflects your wishes.
One of the things I love about Willful is it almost is democratizing the process of creating wills for people. There's a lot of myths and misconceptions out there, I think in large part driven by media. We've all seen movies where, there's some estate and, a stuffy old lawyer gathers the whole family in a tea room or something, and then they read the will. And it seems like such a formal process. And only like the super rich people who have all these estates need to worry about it. But I think, that's obviously from what we're hearing already a big myth. So I wonder, Erin, can you fill us in on some other myths and misconceptions about the will that we should just debunk for everyone right now on the pod?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest myths that we hear are around when and why I need to create one and what happens if I pass away without one. So, for example, I often hear people say, I don't need a will until I'm old and or rich. And the reality is, ideally, you create a will as soon as you turn the age of majority in your province, which is 18 in Ontario, because, we all hope to live to be 100, but the unexpected can happen anytime. And if you pass away without a will at any age, you're leaving a big mess for your family to clean up. You're leaving the courts to decide on various things. And, I get it. You might only be 25 and have $400 to your name, but don't you want that to go to a person or charity of your choosing? If you do pass away without a will, each province has a government formula that dictates who receives your assets. And a big myth I hear is, oh, I'm married, I don't need a will. Everything would just go to my spouse anyways. I have 2 young children. And if I were to pass away tomorrow, half of my assets would be tied up in a trust for them until they turned age 18. And I wouldn't want that. I would actually want everything to go to my spouse. So it's really important to understand a will is not just about who gets your assets. It's also about appointing an executor to be able to act on your behalf, appointing guardians for children so they don't end up with that one weird brother-in-law who hopefully doesn't listen to this podcast. And that you really do, if you don't have a will, want to check that government formula, which doesn't also account for common law spouses in many cases, for friends, for charities. And so to me, I always say to folks, regardless of what age you are, this is such a key document to put you in the driver's seat of your own legacy. And that's what this is really about. It's not about death. It's about legacy. What legacy do you want to leave? Do you want to leave a mess for your family to clean up? Or do you want to leave a legacy of being the person who had their stuff together and who made that process easier?
We should be careful. Like if someone doesn't like their family, they may take that to say, don't have a will because they want to leave a mess to annoy their family. But that's not what you're saying.
I have had people say that to me. You'd be surprised how many people say, well, I don't care. I'll be dead so they can deal with it.
Gosh.
And I say, you know what? I don't want to be at your Christmas dinners. They sound like they might be a little controversial. By and large, though, most people that we speak with say, yes, that's the main reason. I mean, listen, why do we get life insurance? We don't get life insurance because it benefits us. We get it because we want to take care of those that we leave behind and have the peace of mind that they would be okay. And that's the exact same reason that you're getting a will. But to me, I mean, I have a will because I want to make sure there is a guardian of my choosing who, would take care of my children if anything happened to my spouse and I. But I want to be in the driver's seat of not only who splits up my assets at a high level, but I want to give specific gifts. Like I want my sister to get my guitar because she plays an instrument, and I want my art to go to this particular friend, right? So most of us, if we actually had a conversation about it, you would have specific things that you wanted that government formula catch-all would not reflect.
So that actually brings a misconception that I think I've heard other people mention, that if you die without a will, the government takes it all. And you already said that there's this formula. So, I mean, Laura, let's talk about that. Like, if I was to die tomorrow without a will, does the government come in and take everything?
They don't, but what they do is kind of take over everything. And that's a big difference. Every jurisdiction in the country has a different formula. It may not be a formula that you like for what happens to your stuff. And if you haven't said how it is you want distributed, they will come in and there's a default level of distribution. And that may be a surprise to some people. And some jurisdictions like Ontario have really, really old and out of date laws. And some other jurisdictions like British Columbia, for instance, have updated it much more recently. There's a diversity aspect to that, which is really important as well. In some jurisdictions, common law spouses don't get a lot. In some jurisdictions, same-sex partners could be in a very different position than they might be. And for people who may have a more unique set of relationships, it really can make it very complicated. So using that sort of default provision of relying on whether or not the statute is up to date, assuredly, they're not that up to date, and that they will reflect where you want to put things is another. But I do want to say this. You don't get a complete freebie on how you draft your will and give your money to some people. I was talking to a family yesterday. It was a man, Hungarian, Canadian man. He had very formalistic ideas about things. He had a second wife, but his second wife was there from 20 years ago and had no other supportive income. So she doesn't have her own money. She's not previously married. There wasn't a trust for her in some other fashion. She had nothing. And he had left everything to his biological children. That's not going to work. You have an obligation in every different part of the country to distribute your assets in ways that help your dependents. But then once you meet those minimum standards, you can do some other things too. So really important. You can't just do whatever you want. You have some obligations. Same thing if you have, for instance, an adult child with a disability and you've been part of supporting that person. You have an obligation to take care of your dependents. And if you don't do it, your dependents can challenge your will and then you're in a whole mess too.
Oh, so I didn't realize that you just can't arbitrarily cut people out, because that's also in the movies where you're
Yeah,
like, "No, I'm
yeah.
gonna cut you out of the will." So there are actual obligations that, have to be met.
Yeah, and they're different in every jurisdiction. And how easy it is to overcome a will that you may think is fair or not fair also depends on the jurisdiction as well. If you are doing something really simple, and I think this is one of the reasons why I'm a big fan of companies like Willful, is if it's simple. If you are married to one person and it's really clear, or you are a longtime partner with one person and it's really clear, you have either your own kids or you have no kids. You have like a piece of property or a thing that you rent, you've got some bank accounts and some investments, and you're not in lots of other jurisdictions, is that's what we call clean cut. It's pretty easy, particularly if you want to give such and such to your partner and such to your kid or your neighbor or your friend. You want that special locket, as Erin points out, to go to that best friend who you have a connection with, right? That stuff is easy. And that's where the democratization of online wills, I think, really, really blossoms and gets people overcoming some of those, not just financial, but emotional and structural problems of going to a person to get those things done. But what I love about that is it takes those things sort of out of the mix in some degree and helps you think through. It may be that you have more complexity than you thought you did. And so again, some of that educational stuff, which you can see on CanAge's websites, other websites, bar associations, and structures like Willful, they'll build in some of those thinking. Okay, you thought you were really easy, but actually, maybe you need to think it through a little more. And those you need to get legal advice on. People think, oh, it's so expensive. No, actually, mostly getting your wills and powers of attorney, if you have complexity, is incredibly cheap. And add 2 to 3 to 4 zeros after it, because you have to undo the mess. People don't like to pay for services. And for people with some complexity, you should. People who are really clean and easy, that's the best thing for online platforms.
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing, Erin, I like about your solution, as you mentioned before, is you don't pretend to be everything for everyone, right? And your approach actually helps people identify, hey, maybe you ought to go talk to someone else about this. It goes beyond our capacity. What advice would you have for people who just don't really even know where to start in putting the will? You've already said, people even at the age of 18, folks should be having a will. I don't think a lot of people necessarily really would even think about that. So that's great to hear. But what are the steps that someone should take just to get started and to make sure that they do have in their will exactly what they want in it, given these caveats that you can't just like randomly cut people off? So what steps should people be taking?
I mean, I think it starts with a pen and a piece of paper, and really thinking about those three high level decisions. The first being, who is going to be my executor? Who is going to be the person that's going to carry out the wishes in this will? They're going to close my bank accounts, deal with my physical property, file my final tax return. They can work with an accountant or a lawyer to do those things. They don't have to be an expert. But who do I trust to be able to carry out my wishes?
And it doesn't have to be a relative, correct?
It does not have to be a relative. It can be a corporate executor. If you don't have anyone in your life, Willful doesn't accommodate that. But with a lawyer, you can actually write in a trust company, a professional executor, so that you take that burden off of your family, because that in and of itself is a lot of work to leave someone with, even a loved one. But it typically would be, I've appointed my spouse, Kevin. And it's also really important for all of these roles to think about the what if, the backup scenario. So if Kevin and I pass away at the same time, I've appointed my sister, and really layering those backup choices into the will so that it doesn't default to a government formula or the courts having to appoint. So that first name you're going to write down is, who thought starters on who would be my executor, who would carry out the wishes. The second thing you want to write down is who would take care of any minor or dependent children or pets, right? So for me, I have 2 young children. If we're talking about the 65 plus demographic, maybe you don't have children under the age of 18, but you probably have pets. My mom has 2 horses. Those are, not easy animals to care for. And so increasingly we're seeing pet guardians being added in there. They are considered property, so they're not treated the same as humans, but still possible and really nice to do, to say, my neighbor Jane is going to take over care of my dog, because that's unfortunately a reason why a lot of pets end up in shelters. You can also leave money to them as a gift to for anyone who assumes the care of your pets, to be able to pay for a lot of hay if you're my mom with those 2 horses. The third thing you're going to write down is who's going to get your assets. And there's a couple ways to do that. The first is any of those special gifts, whether that's a cash gift to your grandchild, whether that's that locket that Laura mentioned that means a lot to you, or a recipe book that has no financial value, but a lot of sentimental value. And then on a higher level, okay, whatever pot of money is left after all the bills have been paid and the taxes have been filed when I pass away, let's say there's $300,000 left at the end of all of this. How do I want to divide that up via percentage? So, I want 100% to go to my spouse, Kevin, or I want half to go to charity and half to, which is actually a very common option if you don't have children or you don't have a spouse. So those are really the 3 steps to getting started, thinking about who you'd want to put in those roles. And then you can use a platform like Willful to go through the steps, even if it's not the right fit for your situation, just to trigger some of those conversations, right? We have some guidance in education. We have a 30-day refund policy. So if you decide after purchasing, you talk to someone and they say, I don't know, you have this in your life. Are you sure that's the right fit? You have, the ability to then go to a lawyer instead. But it at least gets you thinking through the motions and understanding the steps. But it's really not as arduous as people think it is. You don't have to have your tax returns. You don't have to know your net worth. You don't have to have all of your financial statements beside you. The will is really pretty high level and just governs some of those high level decisions versus something like an asset and liability list, which is a nice thing to put together for your executor, but wouldn't live in that legal document itself.
That's really interesting because I think that people do is another myth. People think that it's such a high hurdle of having to have all of the information, all of your ducks in a row before you can even start the process. But it sounds from the way you're describing it that people could maybe think about it the other way, that the will helps you figure out what it is that you need to get together to make life easier for your executor. One question I had in terms of the executor is, you mentioned it doesn't need to be a relative, it could be a friend, it could be a professional, et cetera. But do you have to ask them in advance? Or can you name someone? Does someone have to be an executor? If I name Rosanne as my executor, and she doesn't know about it, and then she's told at the end, "Oh wait, you're the exec," can she say no way? Because Allison's finances are so complicated, she doesn't want to waste her time on that.
Are you telling me something right now on the pod, Allison?
I'm just checking.
Okay. I'm preparing myself.
So what are the rules there?
So you don't have to be, just because someone's named you as executor in their will does not mean that you have to accept the appointment, which is why we always highlight the importance of discussing it first with your planned executor and making sure they're okay with it. This does not mean you have to discuss the contents of the will and your choices on who you're leaving things to. It doesn't mean you ever have to show them the will before you pass away, but at a bare minimum, you should be running it by them to make sure they're okay with it. And you should tell them where that you have one and where to find it in the event that something happens. Because unfortunately, Allison, you alluded to kind of celebrities being the ones that have wills, but we've seen celebrities like Prince and Aretha Franklin pass away without them. Aretha Franklin's family found handwritten wills in the couch cushions a year after she passed away, supposedly. And so it's not just important to have a will, to have a power of attorney document. It's important that you've told the people that need to take action when something happens that you have it and where to find it.
And it's important to remember you have duties, though. And this is true whether or not you're alive and you're acting as an attorney, making decisions while the person can't or is unable to for other reasons, or when they're dead. They're slightly different duties, by the way, but there are things you have to do. And frankly, they're a pain. So for anyone who is agreeing to be an attorney or an executor, attorney when you're alive, executor when you're dead, you got to know that there's a lot of stuff you have to do. And if you do it wrong, you can get in trouble. And so that means that there's some expectations of things you have to do. If you're an attorney, if you're a person who's taking care of someone when they're alive, but mostly mentally incapable of doing so, or if you're just like me, you have a continuing power of attorney, I didn't want to renew my parking pass in the freezing cold during COVID, you can get your husband to do it for you. I was alive and able to do it. I just didn't want to because it was miserable out. Certain kinds of powers of attorney can start at different times. But when you're will, you're always dead. You got to do things like get the death certificate, pay credit card loans, and other types of financial obligations. You don't take that debt on yourself. A lot of people are worried about that. It's not your debt. You're taking on the responsibility of sorting out somebody else's finances. If you don't like to sort out your own finances, don't agree to be an executor. People think that you're going to do this out of the goodness of your heart. It's really a terrible job. And it means that you're probably going through the house, you're probably getting rid of things, you're dealing with financial insurance policies. And by the way, don't keep your will and your powers of attorney in your safety deposit box. It's the very worst place you can keep it, because you cannot get at them unless you've got the authority to get at them, and the authority to get them is locked inside them. And you have to go to court to get a court order to get it out. So that is my best advice. Lots of people keep it in the freezer, in a Ziploc bag, in a Tupperware, in another bag. Everyone who's in the emergency medical services knows to look in the freezer, and it's because the last place that if your house burns down, it is there. Doesn't mean you should only leave it there.
So
And of having it
interesting.
other places as well, like in the hands of the people you've appointed. But having a backup copy in your freezer is a good idea.
That's amazing. It's something probably I certainly never thought of. I can tell from Roseanne's expression she never thought of it, and she's going to run and make a copy for her freezer now. When we're looking at what other characteristics we should be thinking of for the executor, so obviously someone who is willing and able to take on those kinds of very complicated responsibilities. Is there anything else, Laura, that you would recommend that we look for in characteristics for executors?
Yeah, get that whoever that detail person is in your life, the one who really likes to do all their accounting, who thinks that that's really fun, the person who does their taxes early, right? Who has excellent management skills. It doesn't have to be fancy, but an organized person who likes to deal with details, a person who's got some emotional resilience. So one of the things people will say is, oh, I'll get my partner to do it or my adult child. They're also the person who's in grief. And you may not want, for instance, your partner who is probably in grief and maybe taking care of the grief of all of those other people around you, to also try to figure out, did I pay an insurance form? So think about the dynamics and remember that this is a hard and annoying thing to do. One of the things you can think about is have more than one person to be an executor, and you can have a backup executor. You got to figure out, that's the same true with someone who's a substitute decision maker. But figure out whether they both have to agree, which is called joint, or whether any one of them could do it. That's easier with an attorney. You can have what I call first to the bank, first to the bed. Doesn't matter which kid does it as long as they do it. When you're in an executor relationship, you pretty much always have to agree. You can't kind of go off in the weather. So when you're thinking about having more than one person being an executor, you have to figure out what happens if one person can't do it. It can be a little bit more complicated. Always have backups. And I have backups to my backups. Find also, no matter what, at the bottom of your end, somebody that you essentially never travel with.
And you don't go down in the same plane.
It's like Air Force One.
I had a case that I was trying to help with. There were 27 family members in the same major boat accident, and
Oh my
almost
gosh.
every one of them had appointed each other, and quite appropriately, as backups and backups to backups. They were at the third and fourth cousin, but it was a family reunion, and it was a disaster. So everyone had done all the right things, and everyone had done cautious things. So think about, remember the school form where you have to let your kid, or maybe you were that kid, and it says, pick somebody at the bottom who's an emergency contact who will essentially never be with you. Have someone at the very end, because you never know.
So we received a question, and I'm going to digress a little, but you're talking about complexity, and this boat accident is kind of bringing this to mind for me, about one's last will and testament and whether it's the right place for end of life care. Medical assistance in dying or MAID has been in the news a lot lately. And someone asked us, is the will where those instructions are? I feel like your answer is going to be no, because will dead, power of attorney alive. But let's just debunk that right now. Laura, why don't we start with you?
Roseanne, you've passed my law class. You've got it there. Will dead, powers of attorney alive. That's the key take home right here. So you're right. Of course, it's not in the will because you're already dead. No point talking about being dead when you're already dead, right? So it's obviously, the question really is around, what do I do to express my end of life wishes in the document where that might inform somebody? You can't do it with MAID. First off, not yet. And I don't know if we'll ever see that you can. There's all kinds of reasons for it. Allison, Roseanne, let's have a whole extra conversation on a pod about MAID. But here's what you can do. You can express your wishes. Some places call it values, wishes, and beliefs, whatever the requirement is. You can tell people what you want and why. So my mom doesn't want to talk about any of this stuff because you don't talk about health or money, except I need to know about health or money because I'm her substitute decision maker and her executor. Okay. So we've got something which we call, jokingly, the death drawer. So every time she has a thought or cuts out an article or has whatever, and she certainly won't tell me about it, she puts it in the drawer. The most important thing she can do is what? Put the date on it because it's always the most recent set of wishes. So some people say, well, I wrote it down in my power of attorney, or if I'm in BC representation agreement, or if I'm in Quebec, it's a mandat, but kind of same idea, right? I wrote it down, so I'm fixed in time. No, there's no special aspect. There's not more legal if you write it down. You can have your most recent wishes be any way that you express your values, wishes, beliefs. It's a physical gesture. You can nod. You can sign language. You can do it. Interpretive dance. I've never seen it, but I'm open for it. Okay. Whatever way that you can express it is as important. Writing it down, however, has this problem. People then like to photocopy things. So if you change your mind and nobody knows you've changed your mind or you don't have a handy death drawer, some people may interpret it as that thing that you wrote down. I had a friend with breast cancer, a number of different things happened. She always told everybody that she didn't want things done. She wanted to have essentially every version of a do not resuscitate on it. She'd done all the things and then the medicine changed. And the thing that she was afraid of disappeared. In fact, they created an incredible new treatment. But they were essentially using her old wishes when she couldn't communicate them. And someone literally had to screech in and say, no, she wouldn't have wanted that. And that's why you have to make sure that you're using the most up to date information.
I will say I do like I know you didn't mean it this way, but I do like the idea of the death drawer because one of the things about the whole process is like gearing yourself up emotionally to have this conversation. And if you're not there, the other alternative is doing nothing, as opposed to the death drawer being like, I'm going to do it for myself, put it in the drawer. I just don't want to have the conversation with you.
And I think Erin's got a great thing going as well. And one of the things I think we can do more is have it kind of a death drawer, but an online version. So lots of different things have vaults or they have places where you can update your wishes. And those of us these days, including, 87% of older adult Canadians use the internet every single day with 5 connected devices, right? Doesn't mean that it's everyone all the time. But before 85, we have a good percentage of people who are more likely to go to their computer or phone, and you can update your things then, just as long as you put the date on it. Because just because you write it down doesn't make it more legal. It's just more likely because people will look at something written. But communicate. And that's really important if you've got cognitive impairment, because you still have the ability to express wishes. And part of the job of the attorney when alive, yes, executor when you're dead, but attorney when you're alive, is to, even if they can't actually legally make the decision 100% themselves, you have a positive obligation to try to get their values, wishes, and beliefs, even if they have significant dementia, even if they have had a stroke.
And one of the things we see in the movies is, when they're reading the will in that big stateroom, they'll say, so and so being of sound body and mind, and so on. So presumably, it's Aaron. This is really a question I think maybe for you. It's really important to make sure that that will is done when you still do have the capacity to be able to make your own legal documents, the cognitive capacity. And a lot of the folks in our audience, obviously, given our role as the Center for Aging and Brain Health Innovation, have a very deep interest in dementia. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what's the role that a will plays in the financial wellness of a person, on their dementia journey. Like, what is important for? Is it especially important for someone who may be headed down the path toward dementia to have a will in place, and what does it do for that person and their family?
It's a great question. And, I'll probably defer to Laura on more of the nuances around capacity when it comes to dementia, because that's not something I have a specialization in. But in general, this is why our message at Willful is don't get your first will when you're 70. get your first will when you're 30, right? When we look at the triggers that cause people, the top 3 to come to willful to create their will or update a will, number 1 is having children. Number 2 is buying a home. And number 3 is the loss of a loved one, going to someone's celebration of life or going through that, especially if they didn't have a will, is a trigger for us to think about our own end of life wishes. And if I create my will when I'm 30, even if I never update it, even if the choices are out of date, when I lose mental capacity, whether that's by going through a dementia or Alzheimer's journey, whether that's because I'm in a coma, then I have that document in place and it endures until I pass away versus, all of a sudden I lose mental capacity or I'm drifting in and out of having capacity and it becomes a lot more difficult. And Laura spoke about what substitute decision makers can do for you. What they can't do is make a will that does not reflect your wishes. You can I can direct someone, if I have the mental capacity, but and Laura can maybe speak to this in a bit more nuance, but that's really why our message at Willful is don't wait. Don't wait until it's too late. You can't make a will after you die. Don't wait until it's too late where you don't have the capacity to actually understand the implications of your decision and to be the one directing that. Again, a will is giving you a voice, and that voice has to reflect your choices. Laura.
And when you can make a will is different in every jurisdiction a little bit. So BC, for instance, you can make a will at 16. My 16-year-olds couldn't even match their darn socks, but they can make a will, right? And that's true as well for different types of decisions around when you can make powers of attorney. It's different in every jurisdiction. In Ontario, as an example, you can make a power of attorney for personal care, that health and personal care decisions at 16, but you can't make one for property until you're 18, right? So you have to double check. But it can be helpful. You can do it as a thing together as a family. Hey guys, let's sit down and talk about who's going to make decisions. I call the Hallmark card test. And that is if you would have, I'm not saying you're actually getting around to a mailing thing because that's something we don't do these days. If you would send a card or you would even think about sending a card to somebody for something in their life, could be a birthday, could be a divorce, could be an illness, could be a new home, could be moving to a different jurisdiction, could be a retirement, anything that you might think to yourself, I'm going to send a card. That means you should be rethinking your powers of attorney and your will. And at a minimum, tax season. We're already talking about annoying things anyway, and it's all about papers and documents and whatever else. So while you're at it, my strong recommendation is if you've got one, pull them out and look at it. If you don't have one, get it done by tax season.
Yeah, and keep looking at it once a year, take a check, make sure that it's still all what you want it to be.
That's a great point, Allison. I feel like we have this set it and forget it mentality around end of life planning. I know my mom certainly has been this way. She created a will decades ago with a lawyer, and it's been sitting in the filing cabinet gathering dust for many, many years. And that has been the behavior. We don't look at it like tax returns where they're evaluated and filed annually. It is this shut it away in a drawer, never think about it. And unfortunately, what happens is someone passes away and they named their ex-best friend as executor and they don't speak anymore. And they named, one of their beneficiaries passed away 30 years ago. And it just does not reflect their current life situation. So, I think the death drawer is such a great point about how end of life plans should be current. They should be added to over time because really a will and power of attorney documents are just the tip of the iceberg. What about what happens to your social media accounts? Have you appointed a legacy contact on Facebook? Have you made a list of your assets and liabilities so that your executor knows where your bank account is held and whether you have cryptocurrency, for example? What do you want your funeral to look like? What kind of celebration of life? I want open bar and pizza. I don't want it at a funeral home, right? So there are so many other pieces of information that you can start to compile, collect, and think through and add to that quote unquote death drawer, whether that is physical or virtual, or whether that's just a conversation with a loved one that shares those wishes. But if we could just take an hour in tax season and add on to that already unpleasant task of filing our taxes and think through what can I add to my death drawer this year, we would all be so much better off. And I don't just mean we, the people that will pass away. I mean the people that are left behind. I have, between my husband and I, both sets of our parents are divorced and remarried. That's 8 aging parents for whom I am that person Laura mentioned, the organized one, the meticulous one. I'm going to be dealing with a lot of estates in the future. So it's my vested interest as someone in the sandwich generation who has young children, who has aging parents, to not only have my own plans in order, but to have those discussions with family members as well and make sure they're adding to that death drawer every year.
My mom will be so thrilled that Death Door's got such legs on this one. And I'll just add on to what Erin's saying. She's being very generous with her, with it. But actually, I would even say probably, Erin, you've got more in front of you. It's a club sandwich now. It's not even a sandwich generation. We have 5 generations entering the workforce at once. We're looking at 6 minimum generations at one time, and we've never had so many people in that tight. I'm in the Gen X generation, like that dependency ratio, which is a horrible thing to say, is the reality. And we've never had so much mobility before. So people now move all over the world all the time, work digitally, etc. So if you're one of these people, you need to think about modernizing it as well. The last thing I would say is this: if you get a diagnosis of any health condition, and I don't even mean only dementia, although I absolutely mean dementia, but frankly, any health condition that's not going to make you better in like 2 weeks' time, you really need to use that as a prompt, because any health condition can give you impacts for medication. I mean, you've all been on some kind of medication that made us zooey. Okay, while you're alive, that's your substitute decision-making document. We've all been in a time where we felt like we couldn't make decisions for some reason, or even if you've just broken your leg, you may need someone to go down and do something for you at the insurance company. So if you get a diagnosis of anything that's not going to resolve itself in like 2 weeks' time, you need to start doing your powers of attorney and do them again. At the same time, if you are getting a diagnosis of something that you think has a chance of frankly killing you, then you need to also be doing your will and refreshing that.
So I think we've covered a lot of issues, a lot of complexity, a lot of different situations. I'm kind of curious, what keeps you up at night? Like, Erin, if you had one thing that keeps you up at night in this particular domain, what would that be?
I mean, the thing that keeps me up at night from an exciting perspective is how we can increase access to justice through allowing digital wills. Right now, in every jurisdiction except British Columbia, even if you're handwriting your will, it has to be on paper. It's like it was in 1922 and now in 2024. And so I'm really excited about the legislation in British Columbia that allows you to electronically sign a will, to virtually witness that over video chat, and to store that document online, to email it to an executor, to keep it in a cloud storage location, store it on a platform like Willful. So I'm really excited about the potential to roll that out to other provinces over time as a way to, again, reduce, especially for older adults, reduce the barriers to getting this done, because who has a printer at home these days? And if you're an older adult, especially in a rural location, how are you gathering 2 witnesses in person to get your will executed? That is the number one barrier we hear from older adults. I don't know who to get to witness because anyone I see on a regular basis is a beneficiary in my will and is therefore negated from being able to witness it. So that's what keeps me up at night. And from an excited perspective, what keeps me up from a negative perspective is the stats are dismal when it comes to the number of people who have wills. And with this large wealth transfer, the aging boomer population, I'm nervous for what all of these messy estates are going to look like and the burden that it's going to place on the next generation.
I was about to say I don't even have a printer, and I'm definitely not over 60. So I'm going to run down to, like, I don't know, the print shop and then print out like sensitive documents
And then stick them in the freezer.
and then stick them in the freezer. Yes. Laura, what keeps you up at night?
In fact, so many of these things keep me up at night. I actually wrote a book about it. We never had a handbook. We don't have we don't have like a what to expect when you're expecting, which is actually not my favorite book for all kinds of reasons, but it is one that really every new set of parents gets.
Yep.
And then you can kind of look at it. Actually, I like another one called The Girlfriend's Guide to Pregnancy, which was much more funny and liked it, but there's not a thing. And so I finally wrote a book. It's called Let's Talk About Aging Parents. And the front of the cover has 2 armchairs with steaming cups of coffee. And the book is funny, but it's an actual handbook for how do we talk about these things? What is dementia? What is not dementia? What are some basic things that you can do, like put handrails in your hallways so that people won't fall down? Did you know that if you put some sand and some glue on your front porch, you can reduce fall risks by 56%, which means
I did not know that.
right, and it costs $1.95, right? This is some great things. So it's called Let's Talk About Aging Parents, and it'll be out on April the 30th. But having said that, the big thing that really worries me is that relationships explode when you don't do these things. And people are worried that if you do it, that it's going to make relationships worse, but it is almost always the other. I'm really, really worried about elder abuse and elder financial abuse and undue influence. Again, that's what a big stuff we talk about in my book, because like, how do you deal with it? And there's lots of complexity. And the last thing I'm worried is that people think that if they don't have some kind of substitute decision making, enduring power of attorney, continuing power of attorney, that somehow there's a default list. And their partner, their kids are going to be able to legally do it. And the answer is no. So it's true. If you get hit by a proverbial bus and you're in a coma, in almost every jurisdiction, not every, almost every jurisdiction, there's a default list of somebody who's going to be called. It may not be who you want, but there's a default list. There's no default list. If you do not have a power of attorney document that continues on into incapacity, no one else can make your decisions. If you're dead, there's a kind of a default, right? I'm really worried that people say, well, I don't know, it's all too much. Where do I need to start? Well, I would say at a practical level, do a power of attorney for property first, because that at least is the only document that there's no default. Oh, I don't have a lot of money. Doesn't matter. You can't do anything that is property, financial, technical, pay a bill, go into a social media account without a document that's a power of attorney that continues on to capacity. There's no default list. It will end up in the hands of the public guardian trustee. That's a mess. They don't want to deal with it. And your life will become incredibly complicated. So at least overcome that risk.
So that's keeping you up. When we finish our podcasts every time, what we like to do is to leave actionable tips for our audience. So one is, we've just had a couple of these tips here, and I'm wondering if there is any additional tips that you each might want to provide, and then also, are there any resources that you would recommend? We already heard there's a great resource coming out, Laura's book. Let's Talk About Aging Parents: A Real Life Guide to Solving Problems with 27 Essential Conversations. Uh, any other tips and resources? Erin, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the tip side, it would be making sure that you've thought about and written down those three choices for your will: the guardians for children or pets, the executor, the beneficiaries, and that you kind of noodle on that over the next few days and get to some decisions, because that's going to just make it so much easier when it comes time to actually draft the will. The second tip would be to have a conversation in the next couple of days with someone in your life that you either need to share end of life wishes with, or that you need to ask about their end of life wishes. Prioritize the conversation, pour a glass of wine if you want, but have the conversation. And the third tip would be start that death drawer. Whether that's an online folder, whether that's a physical one. Again, the legal documents are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to making sure your wishes are followed and that your family knows what you would want when you pass. And so whether that's starting small with funeral burial wishes, or that list of where you hold accounts, add to that over time, but it's going to be infinitely helpful to your family. And from a resource perspective, whether or not an online platform like Willful is the right fit for you, we have a really amazing education center at willful.co/learn. All of the content has been vetted by lawyers in each jurisdiction that we work with. And it includes everything from the high level, what is a will, all the way to the nuanced on, everything you need to know about complexities. So pop over there. Of course, it doesn't replace the advice of a lawyer. It's just legal information, but it's a place to start.
That's great. And I'm going to put my funeral playlist, I think, into my death drawer. I'm going to do that later this weekend, maybe. Laura, over to you. Any resources and tips that you'd like to share?
So I think that you did the perfect bridge over to mine, which is start backwards. Start with whatever is not upsetting and is kind of funny for you, right? And I think the playlist is the perfect example. Start with like, hey, if you're dead, like, what do you want that to look like? Do you want a party? Talk about the pizza. Talk about, the big band you want to have. Start backwards, whatever it is that you can think about, and then walk it backwards. Okay, so you want the playlist. Okay, so where do you want to have that? Am I in a bar? Am I in a nightclub? Oh yeah, I want this, right? Then talk about location. Okay, where do you want this to happen? Oh, okay, that'll get us thinking about that. Maybe you've got to go far away. Maybe it's going to go back to South Asia. Maybe it's going to be at, a beach that was special, right? These are all things that don't cause anxiety usually in people. And you can kind of stop and start that conversation backwards. Then walk it backwards and start talking about, well, kind of what do you have right now? That's the next thing. Get out all the paper that you have, because people think that they have things or don't think that they have things that they actually do. So get all of the paper out together. And it could be life insurance policies, it could be taxes, it could be joint accounts, it could be everything. Put it on the table. And if you have someone that can walk it through with you, that's great. It may be that you've got a financial advisor that you talk to. Like, go figure out what you've got and what you don't have, and then try to figure out where we are in relation to that. That's my next step. So work backwards in this regard. My last step is ask the advice of the person who you actually wish would do something about yourself. Nothing parents hate more than their adult children telling them what to do. You're still the kid, mostly, right? Nothing parents like more than giving out advice to their kids. Go and say, hey, mom, I was thinking, it's that time of year. I'm thinking about doing stuff or going on a trip, whatever else. I'd really like your advice. Now you're in a different emotional state. Okay, I'm going to get your advice. Like, okay, so here's what I'm thinking, and I'm thinking this through, and maybe it's this person, but maybe not. Like, can you talk to me a little bit about what you were thinking about that? Now everyone's relaxed. Okay, the roles aren't being pushed in ways that feel unnatural. And now people are kind of open to it. Hey, oh gosh, am I on your thing too? I should figure that out for me as well. Oh, I'm an executive for you. Okay. Oh gosh, do you mind if I get a copy of that? Okay, good. Thank you. I really appreciate your help and advice. Could we do a follow-up time? Because I'm trying to straighten my things. And actually, guess the kids are 24. They should be doing this too. Oh, you know what? Maybe we should redo ours. That's the kind of tips and advice that I give in my book. It's not just what the law is. It's not just what the health is. It's actually how do you do it and still get invited to Thanksgiving dinner.
Well, I have to say, I'm really looking forward to both reading the book and starting my death drawer. I never thought I would say that sentence, but there it is. What an interesting conversation, really helpful. I've certainly learned quite a lot. Rosanne, I think you have too. Hopefully our listeners have learned quite a lot, and hopefully they will get started, actioning all of these really helpful tips. So thank you, Erin and Laura, for joining us on the podcast.
Such a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having me.
To learn more about Willful, you can visit willful.co, and you can find Laura and her team's work at canage.ca. That's canage.ca. We also want to thank our podcast production team, including Monique Chang, Lisa Hartford, Katie O'Connor, Taomi Lam, and our friends over at Podtex.
To learn more about CABHI, please visit us at cabhi.com. That's CABHI.com. We'd also love your support of our podcasts, so be sure to follow us and leave a review on SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your pods.